Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon to viewers in Malaysia, and good morning to viewers in London, where Sami Hamdi is based. Brother Sami, thank you very much for joining us today in this webinar. This webinar today, we are going to be discussing about the latest situation in Palestine, specifically in Gaza. We want to discuss whether things are getting better or getting worse as far as the Palestinians are concerned. And we are very lucky, alhamdulillah, today we have Brother Sami Hamdi, who is a very well-known analyst and commentator on the situation in Middle East. He's a consultant to organizations on political situation in the Middle East. And he is also the senior non-resident scholar at the Hashim Sani Center for Palestine Studies. Thank you again, Brother Sami. Can I ask you the first question now? Since you have just came back from a visit to the US, and I read in the news that the Trump administration is really cracking down on pro-Palestinian activists. We hear stories or reports on students being incarcerated, detained, and possibly going to be deported. And he has also cut federal funding to Columbia University because he said that the university failed to penalize satisfactorily the pro-Palestinian activists. But at the same time, we read the report that Trump sent his representative, his name is Adam Bowler, to talk directly to Hamas, bypassing Israel and even the Palestinian Authority. This is the first time, apparently, that the US negotiated directly with Hamas. And then Adam Bowler said that we are the United States. We are not an agent of Israel. And furthermore, Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, he said that he does not believe Hamas is ideologically intractable, and that there may come a time when Hamas can be involved politically. So there's been a slight change in the U.S. policy towards Hamas and towards Palestinians. But at the same time, we see very bad situation also where students who support Palestinian cause are being victimized. So, Brother Sami, can you please help us to understand the situation? What is your take on the situation?
First of all, thank you very much for having me, and thank you to everybody who's watching this. I think first and foremost, it's important to put things into context, which is that it's very clear that the Zionist lobby and Zionism is lashing out. And lashing out not because necessarily they feel comfortable with their power, but because there is a genuine panic over the cracks that are emerging with regards to their influence and with regards to their power. You will note that there is an awareness amongst the Zionist lobby that Israel is no longer a political asset, but is becoming a political liability. We saw in the US elections, during the Congress elections, we saw in the race of Jamal Bowman in New York, we saw in Cori Bush race that AIPAC did not mention Israel once in the entire campaign for fear that it would be a political liability that would compromise the ability of their candidate to beat Jamal Bowman and to beat Cori Bush. These were some of the most expensive Congress races in history. And AIPAC determined that if they talked about Israel in these constituencies, then it might result in the candidates losing as opposed to winning. We're seeing also that in many US universities, or some US universities at least, like UC Davis and these others, we saw that these universities announced that they would start divesting from Israel. We saw the impact of boycott to the extent that Zionist lobby had to lash out and start trying to push harder for BDS laws, to ban BDS, to ban boycott of Israeli goods, because they were aware there was a growing momentum with regards to boycott. We saw a crackdown on students and student protests, not because the students were weak, but because the Zionist lobby is now deeply concerned that given that it's a widespread student movement, there is an urgency to try to crack down on this student movement, to stop these student movements from taking place, which is why Biden sent in police to beat up the students, and Trump is now cracking down on student leaders subsequently. The idea being that Zionism is not necessarily manifesting power, but rather manifesting a panic at its growing loss of its grip over the US. Moreover, we're seeing that even those amongst the right wing, we saw when Mahmoud Khalil, the Palestinian student on the green card who was detained by ICE and threatened with deportation, we've seen that it's caused concern even amongst right-wing elements. We saw Ann Coulter, one of the most prominent right-wing individuals, and Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and all these others coming out and suggesting that while they may disagree with Mahmoud Khalil, they however have objections to an attack on the First Amendment and to the attack on his first freedom of speech. The reason why I start with this is it's important to put things into context, in that Zionism here is not manifesting power, but rather Zionism is lashing out at a growing power that they fear is compromising their ability to influence the US in the manner that they once did. And I think that was pretty much summarized in the manner in which the original ceasefire was brought about. The ceasefire in which Trump comes to power, and Trump essentially is looking for a quick victory that he can offer his base to say, look, I've come to power and I've already made a difference. And when he comes to power, one of the first things that he does is goes for a ceasefire. And I think that's significant in that it shows that when Trump looked at his base, he believed that they would prefer a ceasefire over a genocide, which is why then he sends Witkoff to Qatar, and then Witkoff goes to Tel Aviv and then forces Netanyahu into a ceasefire deal that makes Ben Gvir leave the Israeli government, that makes Smotrich squeal and cry out in pain, the fact that a ceasefire has been made, which makes Netanyahu start to express significant concern and makes a lot of the Israeli press come out and say, we did not believe that we would be the first losers of a Trump presidency. I think what happened since, to put things into context, is there has been a fierce Zionist attack on Witkoff and indeed on those who supported the ceasefire. Tucker Carlson, although I don't watch his podcast or the like, but there was a very significant clip in which Tucker Carlson was responding to accusations that Witkoff is, quote, a Qatari Islamic agent. And the people he was responding to were Zionists. He was responding to a backlash towards Witkoff, an anger that Witkoff had gone and signed a ceasefire that they considered to be contrary to what the Zionists wanted. Moreover, Adam Bola, who you mentioned there, Adam Bola, the news that Adam Bola was talking to Hamas or talking to the Palestinians, I think it was leaked by the Israelis to try to put pressure on Trump to put him in a difficult situation whereby he would be forced to explain himself to his base in the hope that, or the Zionist hope, that Trump would change course and would go back to supporting the Israelis in their attack. And we saw very soon after that leak that Adam Bola was removed from his position and assigned elsewhere to Afghanistan and to other places as well. But I think Adam Bola interview, as you indicated yourself, spoke volumes about Trump's position with regards to what's happening. The idea being that when Adam Bola was asked, so he did two interviews. He did CNN and he did Fox News. CNN is more of a liberal base. It is Fox News, which is the more interesting interview, because that's the channel that's talking to Trump's base. That's talking to the right-wing base. On the when he's talking on Fox News, that's where he makes the statements that we're not an agent of Israel. We have the United States interest. And he also suggests that Hamas are nice guys. They don't have horns on their head and they don't have, which is quite an extraordinary statement to make for any US envoy. But the leak by the Israelis or the anger by the Zionists suggests that Trump was talking to them, to the Palestinians, without Israel. And the only circumstance you can imagine Trump talking to the Palestinians without Israel is if he went to the Palestinians and they would ask him, where is Israel? And Trump would say, don't worry about the Israelis. Let's talk between us and I will handle the Israelis later, suggesting that Trump had got frustrated with the Israelis. And it's well known that he has a lot of problems, personal problems with Netanyahu. And we saw 3 days or 4 days before he took power that he posted the video criticizing Netanyahu. That's not to suggest that Trump is necessarily pro-Palestinian, but rather what I think is happening is that instead of Zionism being relaxed in its power, we're seeing now Zionism go to every corner it can possibly go to where it can sniff Palestinians and try to tackle it. And I actually think that the Zionists have now opened the Pandora's box in that, as it stands, Palestinian activism is a gray area in the US. In that, is it freedom of speech or is it anti-Semitism? Because there is no real law to define where Palestinian activism actually lies. But what the Zionists have done is they have forced a legal reckoning with Palestinian activism by forcing the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, which means now the case of Mahmoud Khalil has to go through the courts. Currently, when they tried to deport him immediately, they found that a New York judge passed a ruling that Mahmoud Khalil cannot be deported. So the suggestion is that they were trying to move Mahmoud Khalil to a court in Louisiana where they hoped that they would get a more favorable verdict. But the court has suggested that now Mahmoud Khalil should be tried in New Jersey, which is why there is suggestion that they want to delay the case. And here's the reason why they want to delay the case. If you look at African American civil rights in the US, you'll note that a lot of their rights did not come about because of laws in Congress. They came about through cases in the Supreme Court. 1954, Brown versus Topeka, which led to the desegregation between the schools, and Congress was forced to catch up to the Supreme Court. The concern here now for the Zionists is that they've opened a Pandora's box in that if the Mahmoud Khalil case goes through the courts and gets to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that his activism on Palestine does not violate freedom of speech, that he has every right to protest, that he has every right to protest on the student campuses, that would be groundbreaking for Palestinian activism in America if the Supreme Court rules so. And the Zionists, although they believe that the current Supreme Court is made of conservative judges, and they might win with conservative judges, when you look at what conservatives are saying about the Mahmoud Khalil case, what they're saying about the crackdown and deportations, even the likes of Bill Maher, a very nasty individual on TV, coming out and saying that while I hate Mahmoud Khalil, we shouldn't be transgressing on his First Amendment of freedom of speech. It may well be that these conservative judges may not like Mahmoud Khalil, but might rule that he has that right to freedom of speech as a green card holder to go and do activism for Palestine. And that's why I think the Zionist reaction is not well thought out. I actually think the Zionist is like an animal in the corner that's now lashing out because it's beginning to feel that pressure that is taking place. With regards to the deportations, and I think this is the final point that you mentioned, with regards to the deportations, I think what's clear is that the government is doing one thing while the courts are trying to catch up and do another thing. It's clear that those who've been deported, the judges have come out and said that they shouldn't be deported. And that's why we're seeing the government try to act quickly before the courts can get involved, suggesting there is a legal problem with these deportations and what's happening with them. And I think this is an issue that will be decided in the courts. And I think that what we're seeing at the moment is the initial stages, but we may well see it slow down, or even if we don't, we will see this battle play out in which we will get a finality to it through the courts. The point here being is that I think that under the Trump regime, Trump's leanings are towards a ceasefire. But I think there is a Zionist lobby that is waging a heavy counterattack. And I think that Witkoff has felt the pressure, which is why there is a return to the genocide. Some suggest maybe temporarily that it's a bid to try to force Hamas into greater concessions. Egypt yesterday, from the time of this recording, suggested on Sunday there might be a new ceasefire, that there have been progress with talks. We hope for the best with regards to what's happening. I think Trump's rhetoric suggests that he's more inclined towards a ceasefire. I think that this genocide that's taking place is heartbreaking. It's a tragedy that's unfolding. I do think, however, that under Trump, a ceasefire deal is more likely than it was under Biden, not necessarily because there's a difference in Zionism, but more because Biden ideologically supported the Zionists, whereas Trump, you feel it's much more transaction that's being reflected in the statements of his envoys, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, very interesting comment. Thank you very much, Sami. So, in other words, there is a justification for some of the Muslim groups in America to say that even though the chance of Trump being on the Palestinian side, helping the Palestinians, is very small, but nevertheless, it's better than zero in the case of Biden. In other words, it's slow, but it's making progress. And in that sense, there is hope that things may change for the better as far as American foreign policy is concerned under Trump, right? But Sami?
I think that it's unclear whether it will get better or not. I think there are more opportunities under Trump than there were under Biden. And I think primarily because Trump forces a reckoning with American society. And we've seen that in his actions, He's galvanized the whole spectrum of American society, from the left all the way to the right. I think under Biden, there was a tendency to make excuses for Biden, despite the fact that he was committing the genocide. And I'll give you an example. When Biden agreed on the terms of the genocide, agreed to the terms of the ceasefire, Biden's intention was not to implement it. What Biden did instead was, when the Palestinians agreed to the ceasefire, when Hamas agreed to the ceasefire, Biden held the ceasefire agreement and sent Blinken around the world to say, I have a ceasefire agreement ready, but Hamas don't want it. And Hamas said, but we agreed to it. And Blinken said, I have a ceasefire here, but they're not agreeing to it. They said, we've agreed to it. He said, we have a ceasefire here. Blinken used the ceasefire agreement to push the genocide. Blinken used the humanitarian truce to push ethnic cleansing. Blinken used, or Biden used, the humanitarian pair to send US troops to help to facilitate the genocide. I think with Trump, it's different. When Trump suggested that he was going to send US troops to help the Israelis in Gaza, we saw Lindsey Graham come out and say, no, absolutely not. This is a bad idea. We saw Rand Paul, Lindsey Graham, who said, by the way, that this is a religious war. We saw Rand Paul, Republican congressman, saying this is a really bad idea. We saw right-wing media saying, Mr. President, this is a really bad idea. I think that with Trump, it's not necessarily that he might be less or more Zionist than Biden was. I think rather the opportunities in the courts, the opportunities with regards to Trump's nature in the way that he handles foreign policy. I think the opportunities with regards to Trump's relationship with Erdogan, for example. I think the opportunities present themselves in that while the Zionists may push one way, there are more avenues to push another way. Again, nothing may happen. This is just analysis of the opportunities as opposed to what will actually happen. But I do think that the manner in which the ceasefire was brought about before Israel broke it, the manner in which the ceasefire was brought about, and the manner in which Netanyahu scrambled to go to Washington to beg Trump, to say to him, please, what the hell do you think you're doing? Biden didn't do this to me. Why are you doing this to me? I think it indicates at least, and this is what I am optimistic about, it indicates that there is a crack in Zionist influence. There is a crack. It has been hit. It has been damaged. The extent to which is unclear, but the crack is certainly something that has come about as a result of the activism of the Palestinians. And if that crack has emerged, then the question should be, how can we make it bigger and larger? And that's why we talk about the courts and law and activism and protest and the like.
Okay, thank you very much for the detailed explanation of the situation in America. What about in Europe? You are yourself based in Europe. What is your take on the situation in Europe? What about the Zionist lobby in Britain and other countries in Europe? Are they also suffering a crack and a negative trend?
I think that in Germany and in other places, I think that we're seeing that the government is trying to crack down on Palestinian activism, announcing audits into Muslim charities. We're seeing a crackdown on, we see police attending Gaza events to try to intimidate speakers and the like. I think that in France, we saw an anti-Semitism conference, which was organized by the French version of AIPAC, which was attended by two ministers of the government. Mélenchon, the French left opposition figure, came out and asked the government, why are two ministers attending this conference that's clearly being held more on the right wing and held by the French version of AIPAC? Why are they getting involved in this? We're seeing in Europe a very unusual alliance between the Zionist organizations and the right wing who used to chase the Jews, who used to kill the Jews, who used to brutalize them. We're seeing this very awkward alliance that is emerging. Having said that, we're also seeing a movement in which there is a growing popular tendency that is moving away from Zionism and more towards the Palestinians. The Zionist power comes from the top down, but the Palestinian support is increasingly bottom up. We're seeing many people who are changing their opinions from Zionism to becoming more pro-Palestinian, more people who are reading about it, and we're seeing its impact on election trajectories. We saw in the UK that although Labour won a landslide, we saw their majorities in a number of seats decline significantly because of their position with regards to the genocide. We saw, for example, in seats in Birmingham and Manchester, a seat where Labour had 30,000 majority. Today they have a 500 or 600 seat majority, 500, 600 vote majority, which is a decline of 25,000 in one area, 25,000 votes. In Keir Starmer's own constituency, he went from a majority of 36,000 to 18,000. Losing 18,000 votes, suggesting there's clearly something that is wrong over here. And that's why we saw that when the Labour Party came to power, we saw that David Lammy, who had supported the genocide and perhaps continues to support it to some extent, announced that he would suspend some weapons to the Israelis, causing huge reaction from the Zionists themselves. He said we would suspend 10% of weapons because we believe they might be used for war crimes. An admission that Israel might be doing war crimes from its ally. You can imagine if it goes to a court case and they ask David Lammy, why did you suspend weapons to the Israelis? He will say, we thought they were committing war crimes. We saw David Lammy, the foreign secretary, also come out and say that we have suspicions that the way Israel is using our weapons is not conducive to international law, which provoked a reaction from the Prime Minister himself to say, no, we don't agree with David Lammy's statement. But the point is, you can see that they are trying to balance between support for Zionism and the growing public changes in opinion that are taking place. We also saw, for example, that during this Ramadan, the Labour Party have been desperate to engage in iftars with local imams and with local mosques, primarily because they are aware that this is a bloc that could hurt them in the next election. It's a bloc that is angry with genocide. It's a bloc that has power and therefore needs to be appeased. They need to go to this bloc to sit with them. And this is given an opportunity for many imams and many Muslims to speak directly to the Labour Party and convey the message quite clearly that the people are angry with regards to what's happening in the genocide, not just Muslims, but also many non-Muslims too, who went and supported independent candidates. My point is, there is a recognition on the part of the Labour Party and recognition on the part of a number of parties across Europe that this genocide could be an election decider, that it is something that will swing elections if it is not contained, if it is not tackled. And that's why I think that in Europe, I think although there is still a crackdown, it's not as bad as the US. Although there is a crackdown, I think that there are signs that society is changing and certainly signs that power levers can be manifested. And I'll finish with this example. In Manchester, there was a Canadian student of Arab descent who 1 week after October 7th gave an unfortunate interview to the press in which they said that after October 7th, we are celebrating that the Palestinians, the resistance is still there and that the Palestinians can't be ignored by all of these normalization agreements. So the Home Secretary revoked her visa and was threatening to deport her. She sued, and in the first court, they said the Home Secretary has the right to revoke the visa. Then she appealed, and the Court of Appeal ruled that what she said was freedom of speech and her visa should be given back. And now she is back studying in Manchester and the like. This is legally groundbreaking with regards to freedom of speech, but it also indicates that however much the government might seek to crack down, there is still some semblance of law in these countries in which the law and judges, the law is being upheld, the law is providing protection to legitimate freedom of speech. And I think that this suggests that as long as there continues to be activism, not just amongst Muslims, but non-Muslims who form, quite frankly, a huge chunk of the pro-Palestinian activism, I think that for all of the doom and gloom, there is certainly changes that are taking place that suggest there is a possibility for a more optimistic future.
Okay, yeah. We have been discussing America and Europe in terms of the changes in the public opinion and how it's reducing the influence of the Zionists. And we seem to be more dependent or hoping that things will change over there in order to help the Palestinian cause. But we don't seem to be discussing the situation in the Muslim countries, especially the Arab countries. The Arab countries, I don't know what to say. It seems that Muslims around the world have now, or the Palestinians have got to be more optimistic what's going to happen in Europe and America rather than in the Muslim world or the Arab world. In the Arab world, it seems to be completely stagnant and there's nothing to hope to come from there. Is that a reasonable picture or perspective to have?
I think that it's not that the Arab world is stagnant. I think that a number of Arab countries are supporting the Israelis in their genocide and hoping that the Israelis can either exterminate the Palestinians or kick the Palestinians out of Gaza. There is one particular Arab country, which I will hesitate to name just out of respect for the platform, that is proactively lobbying Egypt, Somalia, and other Muslim countries and offering money to convince them to take in Palestinians. There is an Arab country that refused to attend the Arab League meeting to denounce Trump's plans to build a Riviera because they opposed the wording of the Arab League. You'll notice in the Arab League meeting, emergency Arab League meeting, a number of leaders did not attend. And among those leaders was one particular leader who said that he will not attend if the statement says we reject the displacement of Palestinians. He said, I will only attend if we add the word forced. We will not, we object to the forced displacement of Palestinians, essentially representing the Israeli and Trump's position. Trump didn't say, I'm going to force the Palestinians out. He said that we're going to move the Palestinians out in a more humanitarian way. I think the greatest tragedy of what's unfolding in Gaza is not the genocide itself, although that's tragic. It is the fact that this genocide could be stopped tomorrow if the Muslim nations all came together and took a position. And I don't mean military position. I mean withdrawing ambassadors from Washington. I mean expelling, reversing normalization. We haven't seen any country that normalized with the Israelis. We haven't seen them reverse normalization. Morocco hasn't reversed normalization. It's improved ties instead. UAE hasn't reversed normalization. Saudi hasn't. I say when Bahrain normalized because Saudi Arabia told it to normalize. So the fact that Bahrain hasn't reversed normalization suggests that the Saudis themselves are not really interested in reversing normalization either. And I think that's why when Netanyahu gives his interviews, he's very smug. Netanyahu says that there's not that much opposition in the region to what I'm doing. The leaders privately say to me that they don't have any problem with what he's doing with regards to the genocide that's unfolding. In fact, we're seeing that the most proactive plans to displace the Palestinians are not only just coming from the Israelis, but with the support of these Arab nations as well. And that's why I think that a lot of these Arab governments, their focus is not on stopping the genocide, but how to stop the people from revolting because of the genocide, how to keep the people calm. We saw in some places that making dua for Palestine was almost a criminal offense. We're now seeing more dua for Palestine because these governments are concerned that if we're cracking down too much, our people will revolt against us. We've seen in some Arab countries, in the khutbah, they do not mention Palestine or Gaza. What they say is, may Allah give victory to the oppressed in every place, without mentioning Gaza, without mentioning Palestine. We've seen in some countries the khutbah has been reduced to 10 minutes in order to prevent imams from having the time to talk about Gaza, from talking about Palestine. We've seen those who wear Free Palestine tops. We've seen a crackdown on them in Arab countries in a way that we don't see in Western countries. We've seen protests for Palestine being cracked down on in Arab countries in a way that they're not cracked down in Western countries. And that's why I think when you talk about the Arab countries specifically, I think it is a brutal and heartbreaking tragedy, because I truly believe that if the Arab countries reverse normalization with the Israelis, if those negotiating for normalization categorically said there's no more normalization, because you'll notice that there is a couple of Arab countries, including a big one, which keeps saying at every month that we would like to normalize, but you have to give Palestinians a state. We would like to normalize. And the question is, how is it in the middle of a genocide, you're still talking about the possibility of normalization? How is it while Palestinians are being slaughtered, you still keep the hope alive of some normalization? Why not just say this genocide ends all possibility of normalization and make the Americans panic and let them rush in and tell the Israelis, stop, what are you doing? And that's why I think that we've also seen some Muslim countries that have been louder for Palestine, like one where you are sitting in at the moment, that has been threatened by Arab countries, that if it continues to be loud and continues to be loud, then there will be economic consequences and political consequences for doing so. My point is that when your question uses the word stagnant, I don't think the Arab leaders are stagnant. I think the Arab leaders are eagerly proactive. They are very vigorous in what they're doing, and very vigorous not in stopping the genocide, but in their support for the genocide and in trying to contain the Muslim populations from revolting, from taking a position, from taking a stance. you'll notice that some countries, they have been partying throughout the genocide. And when they were asked by their population, can we cancel these parties? Can we cancel these raves? Can we cancel, at least in solidarity with the Palestinians? We saw a response from government officials saying, why should we cancel it for a political event? We should continue regardless, and may God bless Gaza. And then we saw 3 weeks after such statements, we saw these events cancelled because of the death of another leader. So parties can be cancelled for the death of a leader to avoid diplomatic instance in order not to offend that country, but they cannot be cancelled for Gaza. And I think that's the heartbreaking thing. But I do think, in order to finish perhaps on a more optimistic note, I do think that these countries are feeling the heat from the population. I think they are concerned by the backlash. They are concerned by their people. We saw Witkoff in the interview with Tucker Carlson, Witkoff, the negotiator that Trump sent. He said in the interview that if we're not careful, then some regimes that are allied with us will fall. Will fall. Why? Because they can't contain the anger of their people over what's happening with the genocide. We saw Yair Lapid, the former prime minister of the apartheid regime, of the Israeli apartheid regime. We saw Yair Lapid give an interview in which he said that Netanyahu needs to be careful with what he's doing in Gaza, because we don't want to lose our allies like those, for example, his words, not mine, like those in Egypt after what happened in Syria when they lost Syria. We don't want to lose our allies like those in Egypt. So I think there's an awareness that the Arabs' regimes, even those that are supporting genocide, their regimes are under threat because of the anger of their people. And I think this is one of the tragedies. But when you read history, I guess the tragedies, they always have those from inside the community who support the colonizers and oppressors against their own.
Okay. Now, recently there were reports of some so-called scholars who say that one was from Kuwait, apparently. He said that what Hamas did was against Islamic teaching because it resulted in more death and destruction for Palestinians. And some people are observing, and they say that these tens and thousands of Palestinians being killed following the Hamas Tawfan Aqsa operation proves that there was a mistake. And so, how do you advise these people in terms of whether their perception is right or not?
I think that regardless of whether people think it was the right thing or not, I think it's important to remember the context of the time. Netanyahu had gone to the United Nations. He'd stood up at the United Nations. He held up a map in which he said, this is the future of the region. And on that map, there was no Palestine. He had erased it completely. The Israeli ambassador the week before had told, the Israeli ambassador to the UN had told Can Television, the Israeli channel, that normalization with a particular Arab state, that normalization with this country will mean, quote, the complete Arab abandonment of the Palestinians. We saw the Turkish president Erdogan in New York for the first time ever shake hands with Netanyahu because he's under pressure in the Mediterranean, under pressure in the like, and he thought, let me make a truce and let me work with the Israelis while I try to fix my economy. We saw that the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, had gone on Fox News and said, we are closer than ever to normalization of ties. And the Saudis were no longer saying in exchange for a Palestinian state, they were saying in exchange for a pathway to a Palestinian state, a statement that upset the Palestinians so much that when the Saudi ambassador to Palestine went to Ramallah, to Palestine, he announced that he was going to go to Al-Aqsa, and the Palestinians said, if you come to Al-Aqsa, we'll stone you and drive you out. And so he canceled his visit to Al-Aqsa because the Palestinians believed that the Saudis were about to normalize in a betrayal of the Palestinians. You'll remember that the UAE were expanding their ties with the Israelis. Morocco was expanding its ties with the Israelis. As far as Netanyahu was concerned, everything was going his way. And the Palestinians were becoming increasingly abandoned. And Netanyahu had actually moved his forces from the border of Gaza to the border with the West Bank in preparation to attack Jenin and to try to annex the West Bank. Netanyahu was not planning to sit and give peace. Netanyahu was planning to go to war to seize the West Bank, because he believed that the Arabs and Muslim states would do nothing, because they were all shaking hands with him and they were all saying to him that we want to make peace with you. There is a Bloomberg interview where Francine Lacroix, she says to Netanyahu, how will you have normalization with Saudi Arabia if you are consistently going after the West Bank? And he says, they don't mention it as much as you think they mention it. It's Palestinian state is not on the table as much as you think it is. They don't talk about it. And I think that in this climate, I think that everyone has the benefit of hindsight. But I think that the suggestion that there would have been peace without October 7th, and that somehow October 7th is what ruined the peace, I think neglects the dynamics of the weeks before, which gave every indication that Netanyahu was getting ready for war again. Netanyahu was taken by surprise because he wanted it in the West Bank, not Gaza. He was surprised when it came out from Gaza. But my point is that I think the suggestion that we could have had peace, I think underestimates Netanyahu's appetite for war, Netanyahu's desire for war, Netanyahu's consistency in seeking war, and Netanyahu's desire to annex the West Bank at all costs, which he was already trying to do throughout the 2010s, which he was already trying to do in 2019 and 2020, which Naftali Bennett, who came after him, tried to do, and which Netanyahu himself is trying to do now. I think that the question should be less about whether it was right or wrong, and more about how do we create dynamics whereby peace can genuinely be achieved. And I think when you start looking down that debate, we realize that it's not the Palestinians who are against peace. It is the occupying Israelis who are firmly against peace. It is the occupying Israelis who always want war. And it's the occupying Israelis who continue to put the Palestinians in concentration camps and start to create the conditions that lead to something like October 7th, which is why the trend came about, that it didn't start on October 7th. And when people say that it didn't start on October 7th, what they mean is that it is unfortunate what the Palestinians did, that the slaughter and the killing is something that nobody wants, that nobody supports, that nobody wants to see this killing and this slaughter, but also that the problem is not the Palestinians, the problem is occupation, and more people are now seeing that. And I think that those who criticize October 7th, I think that they are criticizing a symptom, not the disease. And now that the world is beginning to look at the disease, we have to also look at the disease. Now that the world are seeing that it's the Israeli occupation that is the problem, and we're seeing these trends on TikTok, we're seeing these trends on social media. The reason Biden wanted to ban TikTok was because Americans were starting to say, hang on a second, it didn't start on October 7th. Hang on a second, if you put me in a concentration camp, this is not my words, this is the words of ordinary Americans on TikTok, I probably would have engaged in. We've seen Israelis themselves say that if I lived like the Palestinians, I would probably join these organizations as well. The more people see the disease, the more they are beginning to understand what happened. And that's why I started the answer of the question with, remember the dynamics of the time where Netanyahu was shaking hands with Muslim rulers and saying that the Palestinians were abandoned. I think this led to the circumstances. And if we really want to prevent something like October 7th from happening again, I think it's time to talk about the colonization and the occupation. And I think that's where the debate is heading. That's why we see the crackdown, because what the Zionists fear the most is not that Palestine will be free next week. What they fear the most is that Americans are starting to read about the issue, that Europeans are starting to read about the issue, that the American public is starting to read about the issue. And as a result, all of the polls are now showing that only 21% of Democrats now support the Israelis. We're seeing that the overall support for Israel in America has gone from 60% to almost 40%, a drop of almost 20%. We're seeing that shift in public opinion that's taking place because of an education of what's happening. And I think, as we saw with South Africa apartheid, when education takes place, the international mood shifts that creates the environment conducive to liberation.
Okay, thank you. So obviously the trend in the States, especially as you described in detail just now, is a very positive trend. But recently there were news reports that have been publicized, especially by Western media, about a few hundred people in Gaza protesting against Hamas, and they are saying that now that proves that Palestinians don't really like Hamas and also the resistance. What's your comment about this development?
I think that Palestinians are within their rights to lament their situation. They are within their rights to be in despair over a genocide that is unfolding. They have the right to plead for an end of the bombing and an end of the slaughter and killing of children and the like. And in that most horrendous situation, a horrific situation that none of us ever dreamed, nor do any of us want to be in, I think they are more than entitled to express frustration and more than entitled to express concern and express their opinion with regards to the conduct of Palestinian factions. I don't think any of us has the right to comment and say whether these sentiments are right or wrong. I don't think anyone has the right to lecture the Palestinians on how they should feel about a genocide that is unfolding. We're not the ones in the midst of the genocide, nor do we know how we would react in the midst of that genocide. And I think I saw a very good Sky News report which suggested that some in the protests are protesting against Hamas and some of them are not. And I think that that is an issue for the Palestinians to debate between themselves who they want to support and who they do not want to support. I don't think necessarily this is an issue that perhaps we should be informing the Palestinians on whatsoever. I think we should be happy with whatever the Palestinians choose to go with. They are the ones who are suffering the most. I think our position is not necessarily pro or anti-Hamas. I think our position is anti-genocide and pro-liberation. I think when you look at movements such as in Algeria or the likes, liberation movements against colonization, I think it's important to know that there were many parties who fought for that liberation. No one asks you whether you supported Msali al-Hajj or whether you supported the FLN or whether you supported all of these other different parties. What they say is, did you support the liberation? And I think that's the question that every Palestinian should ask. I don't think it's about Hamas. Hamas is just one faction that perhaps is making its own interpretation of how liberation should be achieved. Whether it succeeded or not, whether it was right or wrong, that's for the Palestinians and historians to decide. I think more than anything else is, I think that it shows that the Palestinians are frustrated. Palestinians are tired. Palestinians are tired of genocide. Although they are holding on in terms of staying on their land and the like, I think it reflects that 15, 16 months of genocide, there is a desire to see this genocide end. And I think that these protests reflect more of frustration that the genocide is not ending and should be a wake-up call to everybody who is striving to end this genocide, that more should be done and people should keep moving and people should keep making a difference because people are tired.
Thank you. We already coming up to the end, but just before we go, what's your opinion about what countries, Muslim countries, and Muslims around the world should do in order to contribute further to the cause of liberation in Palestine? At the moment, we talk about, there are a lot of noises, a lot of statements by leaders, but my own personal observation is that sometimes the actions don't really match the words. For example, in the case of our country, Malaysia, recently we decided to buy Boeing aircrafts for our national airlines. We know Boeing is one of the main suppliers of weapons to Israel. So if we, what should really people in this country be doing in order to help the Palestinian cause? Words are not enough, isn't it?
I think that the reality is this: when France passed a law recognizing the Armenian genocide, Turkey immediately withdrew its ambassador in protest. When the Canadian ambassador to Saudi Arabia criticized the human rights record in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman kicked out the Canadian ambassador and withdrew the Saudi ambassador. When the Lebanese media minister, George Qardahi, criticized UAE in Yemen, UAE withdrew the ambassador from Beirut and kicked out the Lebanese ambassador from the UAE. When Egypt and Algerian fans clashed over a football match, Egypt withdrew its ambassador and kicked out the Algerian ambassador, and Algeria did the same as well. For things that are much less, we've seen them take diplomatic measures. This is one measure they could take, but they choose not to do so. The Saudi Crown Prince announced that he'd invest $1 trillion in the US economy. He could say, I won't invest the $1 trillion until the genocide is finished, but he's not doing it. Bin Zayed could reverse normalization of ties. Turkey could cancel the F-15s. Or there are so many diplomatic measures they could take beyond that. They choose not to do so. And I think this is the tragedy. There are things that can be done, but they choose not to do so. And like you said with Malaysia as well, on the one hand, statements from the Prime Minister that they support the Palestinians and the like, and then shaking hands with Blinken in Laos and talking about semiconductors and the unbreakable alliance with the US. I think the countries could do more, but they choose not to do more. And that's why I think there should be more pressure on these leaders to do more, because I think these diplomatic measures can end the genocide tomorrow.
Well, thank you, Sami. We are coming up to the end. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us and your analysis. We learn a lot from you. Inshallah, we hope to have more webinars with you. And we pray to Allah Ta'ala in this Ramadan that the genocide will end soon and the Palestinians will be very free soon. Thank you very much, Sami. Thank you. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.